The Colorado winter of 1879 proved merciless, its fury cutting through the deepest canyons and harshest valleys of the untamed West. But for Sarah Mitchell and her 5 children, the biting cold was only the beginning of their struggle. Abandoned by those they called family and trapped in the unforgiving depths of Aspen Canyon, their story wasn't meant to end in tragedy. Instead, their unlikely encounter with Elijah Blackwood, a Half-Cheyenne scout whose own past was etched with loss, would forge an extraordinary bond that defied the brutal wilderness and the prejudices of their time. This is their story of survival, courage, and the unexpected family formed in the shadow of certain death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The merciless January wind sliced through Sarah Mitchell's worn woolen coat as she struggled to maintain her footing on the narrow ledge. The drop below, at least 60 feet to the canyon floor, made her stomach lurch. Behind her, 5 children huddled against the jagged rock face, their thin frames trembling, not just from cold, but from the terror of their predicament. "Keep back from the edge," Sarah warned, her voice barely audible over the howling wind that funneled through Aspen Canyon. Her eldest, Thomas, nearly 13, had one arm protectively around 7-year-old Emma, whose golden braids had come undone in their desperate scramble away from the rockslide. The twins, Abigail and Andrew, both 10, huddled together as they always did when frightened, while little James, not yet 5, clung to Thomas's leg, his face buried against his older brother's knee. Sarah's cracked lips trembled as she gazed upward at the towering walls of rock that had once been their passage through the mountains. The route, now completely blocked by the massive boulders that had thundered down only hours before, had been their only hope of reaching Carson Creek before nightfall. Now, trapped on a narrow shelf halfway down the canyon wall, with the winter sun already dipping toward the horizon, Sarah felt the cold hand of despair tightening around her heart. "Mama, I can't feel my toes," Emma whimpered, her small face pinched and pale. "Come here, sweetheart." Sarah beckoned her daughter closer, crouching to rub Emma's feet through her threadbare boots. They were damp from the snow they'd trudged through. Before entering the canyon, Sarah silently cursed herself for not insisting they stop to dry their footwear. But time had been against them, with reports of a coming storm and the urgent need to reach civilization before their meager supplies ran out completely. Thomas's eyes met hers over Emma's head, a boy forced to understand too much, too soon. "The path behind us collapsed too. We can't go back the way we came." Sarah nodded grimly. The rockslide had been swift and terrifying, blocking the canyon passage ahead while destabilizing the narrow trail behind them. In their scramble to escape, they'd ended up on this ledge, a temporary refuge that now felt increasingly like a trap. "We still have some jerky and a little cornmeal," Thomas offered, his voice steadier than his 14 years should allow. He'd grown up too fast in the years since his father's death. Sarah saw too much of Matthew in him, the same determined, set to his jaw, the same protective instinct toward his siblings. "We'll be all right," Sarah said, with a conviction she didn't feel. She'd said those same words when Matthew had first fallen ill last winter, when the cough that had started as a minor irritation had deepened, rattling in his chest until he could barely draw breath. She'd said them again as he'd slipped away, his once strong hands growing limp in hers. She'd whispered them in the dark nights that followed, as her brother-in-law Jeremiah had slowly but surely made it clear that a widow with 5 children was an unwelcome burden on the family ranch. The memory of Jeremiah's cold eyes as he'd informed her that the ranch belonged to him now, not to her or her half-wild brood, made her stomach clench with renewed anger. The small allowance he'd given her to start afresh somewhere else had barely covered their passage this far. The promised teaching position in Carson Creek was their only hope, and now the canyon stood between them and that fragile future. "I'm Scared, Mama, Andrew whispered, his freckled face ghostly pale. Unlike his twin sister, who faced fear with stubborn defiance, Andrew had always been sensitive, more likely to feel the weight of the world. I know, sweetheart. But we've faced hard times before, haven't we? Sarah knelt beside him, gathering both twins close. Their coats were too thin for this elevation, the hand-me-downs from cousins already worn through at the elbows. Remember what your father always said? Mitchells don't surrender, Abigail recited dutifully, though her voice quavered. That's right. Sarah forced a smile. And we won't surrender now. The ledge they occupied was perhaps 15 feet long and 7 feet at its widest point. A shallow depression in the rock face behind them offered minimal shelter from the wind, but nothing that could be called a cave. Sarah assessed their situation with growing dread. The afternoon light was already fading, casting long shadows through the canyon. They carried no lantern, another economy she now bitterly regretted. Thomas, help me gather what brush we can find. We need to build a fire before dark. Sarah began searching the ledge for any scant vegetation that might serve as kindling. There's hardly anything here, Ma, Thomas observed, but he joined her in the search, carefully collecting the few dried scraps of sagebrush and twisted pine branches that had somehow taken root in the rocky crevices. It'll have to do. Abigail, check our packs for anything else that might burn. Papers, letters. At this point, Sarah would sacrifice anything to keep her children from freezing through the night. As the shadows lengthened, Sarah worked to create a small fire pit away from the edge, using rocks to build a crude windbreak. The kindling they'd gathered would last an hour at most. The blankets they carried, just 3 to share among 6, would provide little protection against the mountain night. Thomas, let's get the little ones settled closest to the rock face. You and I will take the outside. She didn't need to explain why. They both knew they were creating a human barrier between the younger children and the precipitous drop. The sun disappeared behind the western ridge, plunging the canyon into premature darkness. Sarah struck the flint with trembling hands, cursing softly when the first sparks failed to catch. 3 more attempts, and finally a tiny flame flickered to life among the dry twigs. The children huddled closer, their faces ghostly in the wavering light. Tell us a story, Mama, Emma pleaded, her teeth chattering despite being sandwiched between her siblings. Sarah swallowed hard. Normally she welcomed these moments, the quiet times when she could weave tales for her children, watching their eyes widen with wonder or sparkle with laughter. But tonight, with hunger gnawing at her own stomach and the bitter knowledge that their situation was dire, stories felt like hollow comfort. Yet she began anyway, her voice soft but steady, spinning. A tale of brave pioneers who overcame impossible odds. She didn't mention the letters she carried in her coat pocket, correspondences with the school board in Carson Creek, who had reluctantly agreed to consider a widowed mother for their teaching position. She didn't speak of the last of their money, spent on supplies that now lay scattered somewhere on the canyon floor after their packs had been lost in the rock slide. Some burdens were hers alone to bear. The fire sputtered weakly against the darkness. Sarah fed it the last of their kindling, painfully aware that once it died, they would face the full force of the mountain night. Try to sleep, she urged the children, tucking the blankets around them as they huddled together like a litter of kittens. James had already nodded off, exhaustion overcoming fear. The twins followed soon after, their breathing synchronizing as it had since their earliest days. Only Thomas and Emma remained awake, their eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "We should have stayed," Emma whispered so quietly that Sarah almost didn't hear her. "No, sweetheart. There was nothing for us there anymore." Sarah stroked her daughter's tangled hair, working gently at the knots. "Uncle Jeremiah might have let us stay if we'd worked harder," Emma persisted, her child's logic seeking simple solutions to complex problems. Sarah felt Thomas stiffen beside her. At 13, he understood more than his siblings about why they'd been forced to leave the only home they'd ever known. He'd witnessed the gradual disappearance of their belongings after Matthew's death, family heirlooms and treasured possessions quietly claimed by Jeremiah's wife, Eleanor. He'd overheard the whispered conversations about how the ranch had always been meant for true Mitchell blood, not the children of Matthew's unfortunate choice of bride. "Some people can't see past their own greed," Sarah said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Your uncle made his choice, and now we've made ours." "But what if we don't reach Carson Creek?" Emma's voice trembled. "What if we're stuck here forever?" "We won't be," Sarah promised, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Tomorrow, when there's light, we'll find a way down." The fire gave one last feeble flicker before dying completely, leaving them in darkness, broken only by the cold light of distant stars. Sarah drew her children closer, trying to share what little warmth her body could provide. Sleep eluded her as the night deepened. The wind moaned through the canyon, a mournful sound that seemed to echo her own fears. She thought of Matthew, of his strong hands and quiet determination. "You're the strongest woman I know, Sarah Mitchell," he'd told her once, after she'd helped birth the Henderson's twins during a blizzard that had prevented the doctor from reaching them. She didn't feel strong now. She felt terrified, aware that her children's lives hung in a precarious balance, and she alone was responsible for them. A sound drifted up from below, a cry that might have been human or might have been the wind, playing tricks. Sarah stiffened, straining to hear. There it came again, unmistakably the howl of a wolf, closer than comfort would allow. Beside her, Thomas stirred. "Ma?" "Hush now, just the wind," she lied, pulling him closer. Somewhere in the darkness below, another wolf answered the first. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Wolves rarely attacked humans, she reminded herself. But hunger could drive any creature to desperation, and they were vulnerable here, trapped without shelter or weapons beyond Thomas's small hunting knife. The night stretched endlessly, marked by the painful cramping of Sarah's muscles as she tried to maintain her position as a barrier between her children and the drop. The cold seeped through her clothing, settling into her bones with a deep ache that made every breath a conscious effort. Dawn broke with agonizing slowness, pale light creeping down the canyon walls until it finally touched their ledge. Sarah stirred, her body protesting every movement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The children were still asleep, huddled together in a tangle of limbs and blankets. Their breaths formed small clouds in the frigid morning air. Sarah carefully untangled herself and moved to the edge of the ledge, needing to assess their situation in daylight. What she saw made her stomach sink. The canyon floor was further away than she'd estimated in yesterday's panic, at least 70 feet of sheer rock face, and the path they'd need to descend looked treacherously unstable, with loose shale and crumbling handholds. "Ma!" Thomas's voice came from behind her, rough with sleep and cold. Sarah straightened her shoulders before turning to face him, forcing her expression to reveal nothing of her dismay. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Not great." He rubbed his hands together, blowing on them for warmth. "I've been thinking about how to get down." Sarah nodded, grateful for his practical nature. "So have I. It won't be easy, but I think if we're careful." A sound from above cut her off, the distinct clatter of rocks displaced by movement. Sarah froze, her gaze darting upward. After yesterday's rock slide, any disturbance could trigger another. She quickly moved toward the children, ready to shield them if necessary. "Hello down there!" A man's voice echoed through the canyon, startling the remaining sleeping children awake. Sarah stared upward, hardly daring to believe her ears. Against the bright morning sky, a silhouette appeared at the canyon's rim, maybe 100 feet above them. "Hello!" she called back, her voice cracking. "We're trapped on a ledge." The figure disappeared briefly, then reappeared. "How many of you?" "6. Myself and 5 children." There was a pause, then, "Stay put. I'm coming down." The next 20 minutes passed in an agony of anticipation. The children, now fully awake, alternated between excitement at the prospect of rescue and fear that their would-be savior might fall to his death attempting to reach them. Sarah watched the man's slow, careful descent with a mixture of hope and dread. He moved with the confidence of someone familiar with climbing, finding handholds where she saw only smooth rock, but one slip would mean disaster. Finally, he reached a point about 15 feet above their ledge. From this distance, Sarah could see him more clearly, a tall man with broad shoulders, long dark hair pulled back with a leather cord, and skin weathered by sun and wind. He wore buckskin leggings and a heavy wool coat, with a rifle strapped across his back. "I'm going to lower a rope," he called down. "Can your oldest boy climb?" Sarah glanced at Thomas, who nodded firmly. "Yes," she called back. "Good, I'll secure. Him first, then come down for the rest of you." The rope snaked down, its end weighted with what looked like a small leather pouch. Thomas caught it, his expression determined despite the fear Sarah could see flickering in his eyes. "You don't have to do this," she whispered to him, suddenly reluctant to let him take the risk. "Yes, I do, Ma." Thomas squared his shoulders in a gesture so like his father's that Sarah's heart ached. Dad would expect it. The stranger called down instructions, his voice calm and assured. Sarah watched, her heart in her throat, as Thomas secured the rope around his waist and began the precarious ascent, finding footholds where the stranger directed. Twice he slipped, hanging by the rope and the strength of the man above, but each time he regained his position and continued upward. When Thomas finally reached the spot where the stranger waited, Sarah let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She saw the man clasp Thomas's shoulder in a gesture of approval before securing him to an outcropping. "I'm coming down now," the stranger called. "Get the little ones ready." He descended with remarkable agility, seeming to flow down the rock, face rather than climb it. When he reached their ledge, Sarah finally got a clear look at him. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with sharp features and eyes the color of amber. His face bore the distinctive, high cheekbones and copper tones of native heritage, though his build and some features suggested mixed ancestry. "Ma'am," he nodded to her, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Elijah Blackwood. I was scouting the pass when I heard voices." Sarah Mitchell. She found herself suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance, her hair escaping, its pins, her dress stained with dirt and stone dust. "These are my children. You've met Thomas already. This is Abigail and Andrew, Emma and James." Elijah's gaze swept over the children, assessing them with the same practical efficiency he'd likely use to evaluate terrain or weather conditions. "The little one comes up with me first," he decided, crouching down to James's level. "Ever been carried like a sack of potatoes, young man?" James shook his head, eyes wide. "Well, you're about to." A hint of smile touched Elijah's lips. "I'll tie you to my back, and you hold on tight as a tick. Think you can do that?" James nodded solemnly. Sarah watched as Elijah deftly fashioned a secure harness from the rope, binding James to his back, in a way that left the scout's hands free for climbing. "Ma'am, once I get your boy up, I'll come back for the next youngest, then work our way up." His amber eyes met hers directly. "It'll take time, but we'll get everyone off this ledge before nightfall." The simple confidence in his voice sparked something in Sarah's chest, a fragile hope she'd almost forgotten was possible. She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. Elijah checked the ropes one final time, then turned to the rock face. Before beginning his ascent, he paused and glanced back at Sarah. "Been tracking you since Walker's Pass. Saw the slide yesterday, but couldn't get here before dark. You were tracking us." Sarah frowned, uncertain whether to be comforted or alarmed. Marshall in Carter's Landing mentioned a widow and 5 kids heading for Carson Creek. He shrugged slightly. Trail this time of year, thought someone ought to keep an eye out. With that, he began climbing, James clinging to his back like a determined little monkey. Sarah watched them ascend, her heart racing each time Elijah's foot sought purchase on the unstable rock. The twins pressed against her sides, while Emma clutched her hand so tightly that Sarah could feel her pulse. "He looks like the warriors in the Penny Dreadfuls," Abigail whispered, awe and wariness mingling in her voice. "Hush," Sarah admonished. Gently, stories and stereotypes had no place here, not when this man was risking his life to save theirs. Yet she couldn't deny the unsettling awareness that they were now entirely dependent on a stranger who, by his own admission, had been following them through the mountains. As Elijah reached Thomas's position and carefully transferred James to the relative safety of the outcropping, Sarah found herself studying him more carefully. The fluid grace of his movements spoke of a lifetime navigating terrain like this, but it was the respectful care with which he handled her frightened youngest that truly caught her attention. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fragile trust forming in this most desperate of circumstances. In that moment, standing on a narrow ledge between survival and disaster, Sarah Mitchell realized that whatever happened next, their lives had irrevocably changed course. Her children's fate now rested in the hands of Elijah Blackwood, a Half-Cheyenne scout, whose sudden appearance felt less like chance and more like the answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. The rescue from the canyon ledge took nearly 4 hours. Elijah Blackwood worked methodically, his movements economical and sure as he transported each child to safety. Emma went after James, then the twins, with Sarah insisting on being the last to leave their precarious perch. As Elijah helped her over the final outcropping to where her children waited, Sarah's legs buckled, partly from exhaustion, partly from the overwhelming relief of solid ground beneath her feet. "Easy now," Elijah murmured, his strong hand steadying her elbow. "First, time off a ledge always the hardest." Sarah straightened, brushing dirt from her skirts with trembling hands. "Thank you seems inadequate, Mr. Blackwood." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps, before his expression settled back into its customary reserve. "Just Elijah is fine, and we're not out of trouble yet." He gestured toward the western ridge, where dark clouds were building. "Storm's coming 2, maybe 3 hours before it hits. Canyon's treacherous in weather like that." "Carson Creek," Sarah began. "How far?" 3 days' journey in good conditions. Elijah's amber eyes assessed her and the children with frank appraisal. "Which these aren't." Thomas stepped forward, standing taller as if trying to match the scout's height. "We can manage. We've come this far." Elijah acknowledged the boy with a slight nod. "No doubt. But not before that storm hits, and not with supplies lost in the slide." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah asked, the word suggest carrying more weight than she'd intended. After months of having decisions made for her, of being told rather than asked, the habit of deference was hard to break. Elijah seemed to understand this. He didn't immediately answer, instead crouching to adjust the leather thong on James's too large boot, a small kindness that caught Sarah off guard. "There's a line shack about 4 miles north," he said finally, rising to his feet, "used by trappers and scouts. Basic, but solid. We can shelter there until the storm passes." 4 miles. Sarah glanced at her children. James was already drooping with fatigue, and even the typically energetic twins showed signs of exhaustion. "I can carry the little one," Elijah offered, following her gaze. "And we'll pace ourselves. Better slow movement than no movement at all." The practicality of his words resonated with Sarah. She nodded, gathering her scattered thoughts along with what few belongings they'd managed to keep. "Children, gather your things. We're going with Mr. Blackwood." "Elijah," he corrected quietly. "Elijah?" Sarah amended, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. The journey to the line shack tested what little strength Sarah had left. The terrain was unforgiving, sharp inclines followed by treacherous descents, narrow paths skirting steep drops. James rode on Elijah's shoulders, his small hands gripping the scout's dark hair. Emma struggled to keep pace, her breath coming in ragged gasps that worried Sarah, but the girl refused to complain. Even Thomas, for all his determined stoicism, couldn't hide his fatigue. Abigail, always the most outspoken of the twins, finally broke the strained silence. "Are you really Cheyenne?" she asked Elijah, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Sarah sucked in a breath. "Abigail! That's not half," Elijah interrupted, seemingly unbothered by the directness of the question. "My mother was Cheyenne. Father was a trapper from Kentucky." "Where are they now?" Andrew asked, his natural curiosity overcoming his usual shyness. Shadow passed over Elijah's face. "Gone." The single word, delivered without elaboration, carried enough weight to silence even Abigail's questions. They continued in quiet after that. The only sounds were their labored breathing and the crunch of boots on rocky ground. An hour into their journey, fat snowflakes began to fall, swirling lazily at first, then with increasing urgency. The temperature dropped sharply, the wind picking up strength as it funneled between rocky outcroppings. "We need to move faster," Elijah announced, shifting James to a more secure position. "Storm's coming in quicker than I thought." Sarah nodded grimly, urging the twins to increase speed. Emma lagged behind, her breathing worryingly shallow. "Emma, sweetheart, are you—" Sarah began, but was cut short as Emma stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her. Thomas caught his sister before she hit the ground. "Ma, she's burning up!" Sarah pressed her palm to Emma's forehead, alarm shooting through her at the heat radiating from the child's skin. How had she missed this? The signs had been there. Emma's unusual quietness, the flush in her cheeks that Sarah had attributed to exertion. "Fever," she said, her voice tight with fear. Mountain fever could kill a child in days, sometimes hours. Elijah was beside them, in an instant, handing James to Thomas before kneeling to examine Emma. His calloused fingers pressed gently against the girl's throat, checking her pulse. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, his tone sharper than before. I didn't, Sarah stammered, self-recrimination flooding through her. What kind of mother didn't notice her own child falling ill? "Not your fault," Elijah said, reading her expression with unsettling accuracy. "Trail fatigue masks fever signs." He stood, lifting Emma into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "We need to get her warm. Get medicine into her." "But James," Sarah began. "Thomas can manage. Him for now." Elijah's gaze shifted to the sky, where the clouds had darkened to an ominous gray. "We need to move. Now." The next 2 miles passed in a blur of increasing snow and mounting concern. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness in Elijah's arms, her face flushed with fever. James, understanding the gravity of the situation despite his young age, allowed Thomas to carry him without complaint. The twins huddled close to Sarah, more subdued than she'd ever seen them. Just as visibility began to deteriorate seriously, a dark shape emerged from the swirling white. The line shack, a sturdy log structure nestled against a rock face for protection from the elements. "Thank God," Sarah breathed, relief washing through her. Elijah shifted Emma in his arms and moved toward the door. "It won't be fancy, but it'll keep the cold out." The interior of the shack was Spartan but clean, a testament to the unwritten code of frontier hospitality. A small cast-iron stove occupied one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 benches another. A set of bunks lined the far wall. while shelves holding basic supplies ran along the fourth. The space was perhaps 15 feet square, cramped for 6 people, but infinitely better than the open mountainside. "Get her on the lower bunk," Elijah instructed, carrying Emma to the bed. "Thomas, wood for the stove. There should be a stack against the outside wall. Twins, check those shelves for anything useful. Bandages, medicines." His calm, measured commands gave structure to their panic. Sarah knelt beside Emma, stroking damp curls from her daughter's forehead. The girl's skin burned beneath her touch. "What can I do?" she asked, looking up at Elijah. "Find the water barrel. Should be in the corner. We need to cool her down." Sarah located the barrel, half full, the water cold but clean. She filled a dented tin cup and returned to Emma's side. Elijah had removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. He produced a small leather pouch from his pack, extracting several dried plants that Sarah didn't recognize. "What is that?" she asked, watching as he crushed the plants between his fingers. "Willow bark, fever plant, other things." He glanced up, perhaps sensing her apprehension. "My mother was a healer. These won't hurt her." Sarah nodded, choosing trust because there was no alternative. "What do you need me to do?" "Soak this." He handed her a square of clean cloth. "And lay it on her forehead. Then help me get this tea into her when it's steeped." They worked together as the storm raged outside, the wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. Thomas kept the fire stoked while the twins organized the supplies they'd found. James sat quietly on one of the benches, his wide eyes following every movement his mother and the scout made. "Will Emmy be okay?" he asked finally, his small voice barely audible over the storm. Sarah opened her mouth to offer reassurance she didn't feel, but Elijah spoke first. "Your sister's strong," he said, his tone matter-of-fact as he stirred the herbal mixture. "Fevers. Fighting her, but she's fighting back. That's good." James considered this with solemn intensity. "Like when Dad got sick." A leaden silence fell over the cabin. Sarah felt the familiar ache bloom in her chest, grief never far from the surface, sharpened by her son's innocent question. "No, James," Thomas answered, his voice rough with emotion he tried to hide. "This is different. Emma's going to be fine." Elijah's eyes met Sarah's over Emma's prone form, a question in their amber depths. She gave a small shake of her head. "Not now?" He nodded once in understanding. The next few hours passed in tense vigilance. Elijah coaxed the bitter herbal tea down Emma's throat, while Sarah maintained a rotation of cool cloths on her forehead and neck. Outside, the storm developed into a full blizzard, snow accumulating rapidly against the cabin's small window. Night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that the stove could only partially dispel. Thomas and the twins huddled near the fire, sharing the single blanket they'd managed to salvage from their packs. James had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled up at the foot of Emma's bunk like a faithful puppy. "You should rest," Elijah said quietly, noticing Sarah's drooping shoulders. "I'll watch her." Sarah shook her head stubbornly. "I'm her mother, and mothers need sleep too." A hint of something, perhaps amusement, softened his stern features. "You're no good to her exhausted." The logic was irrefutable, but Sarah remained where she was, adjusting the cloth on Emma's forehead. The girl's breathing had eased somewhat, though her skin still burned with fever. "She reminds me of someone," Elijah observed, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping children. Sarah glanced up, surprised by the personal observation from a man who seemed to measure every word. "Who?" A heartbeat of silence, then, "My sister. Same determined little chin." The simple statement opened a window into a past Sarah hadn't expected him to share. "You have family, then? Besides your parents, I mean." Elijah's expression shuttered. "Had influenza 6 winters ago." Sarah's heart contracted with sympathy. "I'm sorry." He acknowledged her words with a slight nod, then rose to check the fire. The conversation was clearly over. Later, as the storm reached its peak, howling winds rattling the cabin's shutters, Sarah finally surrendered to exhaustion. She slumped against the bunk, her head coming to rest on the edge of Emma's mattress. She meant to close her eyes for just a moment, but sleep claimed her instantly. She woke to grey dawn light, filtering through the cabin's small window, and the sensation of weight across her shoulders. Disoriented, she straightened, causing a heavy fur to slide down her back. Someone, Elijah, had covered her with his coat during the night. Emma's brow was cooler to the touch, her breathing deeper and more even. Relief washed through Sarah like a physical force. She looked around the cabin, finding Thomas and the twins still asleep near the stove. James had migrated during the night and was now curled against his sister on the narrow bunk. Elijah sat at the rough table, using a whetstone to sharpen a hunting knife with methodical precision. He glanced up, nodding briefly when he saw her looking. "Her fever broke about an hour ago," he said quietly. "She'll be weak for a few days, but she'll recover." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, offering silent thanks. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need." The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel resumed. Any decent person would have done the same. Most decent people wouldn't have tracked a strange family through mountain passes in winter, Sarah pointed out, moving to join him at the table. "Why did you really follow us, Mr. Blackwood?" He set down the knife, meeting her gaze directly. "The marshal in Carter's Landing mentioned a widow heading into the mountains with 5 children and no guide. Said you were aiming for Carson Creek before the passes closed, and you took it upon yourself to follow us because I've seen what happens to unprepared travelers in these mountains." His voice remained neutral, but something in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, told Sarah there was more to this story than he was sharing. "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons." She glanced around the cabin, noticing for the first time the practical touches that spoke of preparation. The neatly stacked firewood, the supplies organized on shelves, even a small pot of what smelled like oatmeal bubbling on the stove. "You've done this before, rescued people, I mean." "Not exactly." His hands resumed their work, the whetstone gliding along the blade in smooth, practiced strokes. "I scout for the army sometimes, guide travelers, track the marshals when needed." "A man of many talents," Sarah observed. The barest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Just a man who knows these mountains." A small sound from Emma's bunk drew Sarah's attention. She crossed the room quickly, finding her daughter's eyes open, though clouded with confusion. "Mama?" Emma's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. "I'm here, sweetheart." Sarah smoothed the girl's tangled curls, her heart overfull with relief. "How do you feel?" "Thirsty." Emma's gaze drifted past Sarah, widening slightly at the sight of Elijah, who had approached with a cup of water. "Who's he?" "This is Mr. Blackwood, Elijah," Sarah corrected herself. "He helped us when we were trapped in the canyon, and he's been taking care of you while you were sick." Emma studied him with the direct, unfiltered curiosity of childhood. "Are you an Indian?" "Emma," Sarah gasped, mortified, but Elijah merely nodded, seemingly unbothered by the question. "Half. My mother was Cheyenne." Emma considered this information solemnly. "My friend Lily's father says Indians are dangerous." An uncomfortable silence fell. Sarah opened her mouth to apologize, but Elijah spoke first, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. Some aren't. Same as white folks." He offered the cup to Emma. "Drink slowly." The simplicity of his response diffused the awkwardness of the moment. Emma accepted both the water and the answer, sipping carefully under Sarah's watchful eye. The storm continued throughout the day, though with less ferocity than the night before. By late afternoon, Emma was able to sit up and take a few spoonfuls of broth that Elijah had prepared from dried meat and wild onions found in the cabin stores. The other children, initially wary of the taciturn scout, gradually warmed to his presence, especially after he produced a set of carved wooden dice and taught them a simple game. Sarah watched the interaction with mixed emotions. Relief at Emma's improvement warred with growing anxiety about their situation. The storm had already cost them a full day, and Emma was in no condition to travel. Their meager funds couldn't sustain an extended delay. The teaching position in Carson Creek might not wait for her. Something troubling you? Elijah's quiet question startled her from her thoughts. He had moved to stand beside her at the window, where she'd been staring out at the swirling snow. Sarah sighed, seeing no point in deception. Everything, if I'm honest. Time, money, weather, all working against us. Elijah studied the ceiling, beams for a moment, as if finding answers in the rough-hewn wood. Carson Creek will still be there when the weather clears. The position I was promised might not be. Sarah hadn't meant to share this concern, but the words escaped before she could reconsider. Teaching? He guessed, glancing at the book she'd been reading to the children earlier, a battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress that had somehow survived their ordeal. She nodded. The school board was reluctant enough to consider a widow with children. If I'm late, they'll understand. Mountain weather's no secret in these parts. Perhaps. Sarah wasn't convinced. In her experience, life rarely granted such allowances, especially to women with no husband to speak on their behalf. Elijah seemed to sense her doubt. I know the schoolmaster there, Jackson Williams, fair man, won't hold the weather against you. The casual mention of a connection to her destination caught Sarah off guard. You know Carson Creek? I know most places within 100 miles of here. He turned his gaze back to the window. Snow's letting up. Should be clear by morning. The abrupt change of subject was becoming a pattern, Sarah noticed. Whenever conversation veered toward the personal, Elijah redirected it to practical matters. She wondered what experiences had taught him such careful guardedness. Will we be able to travel tomorrow? She asked, accepting the shift in topic. Depends on your girl. Fever's gone, but weakness will linger. Might need another day. Sarah bit her lip, calculating supplies and time in her head. We don't have much food left. I'll hunt at first light, Elijah said simply. Deer move after storms, and there's a stream not far. Might catch some trout. If they're not iced over, the confident practicality of his response eased some of Sarah's immediate concerns. With food and shelter secured, at least they wouldn't face immediate peril. In that case, I should see to our other supplies. She moved toward their salvaged packs, determined to take inventory of what remained. The evening passed in quiet domesticity that felt surreal, given their circumstances. Sarah mended torn clothing by firelight, while Elijah showed Thomas how to properly clean and oil a hunting knife. The twins engaged in a whispered game of their own invention, while James dozed beside Emma, who was looking markedly better with each passing hour. Outside, the storm gradually spent its fury, the howling wind diminishing to an occasional gust. Stars appeared in breaks between the clouds, their cold light reflecting off new fallen snow. When the children finally settled for sleep, Thomas and the twins in the upper bunk, Sarah sharing the lower with Emma and James, Elijah took his position near the door, wrapped in a single blanket, despite Sarah's protests that he should take the bench by the fire. I've slept in worse places, was his only comment as he positioned himself with his back against the wall, rifle within easy reach. Sarah lay awake long after the children's breathing had deepened into sleep, watching the scout's silhouette in the dying firelight. He remained upright, alert in a way that spoke of years of discipline and perhaps necessity. You don't have to keep watch, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. We're safe here, aren't we? Elijah turned his head slightly, the movement almost imperceptible in the dim light. Habit, he replied after a moment, hard to break. Sarah understood habits born of necessity. Since Matthew's death, she'd developed her own, checking locks twice, counting their meager coins daily, always planning for the worst while hoping for the best. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." He made no reply, but Sarah thought. She saw him nod slightly before turning his attention back to the door. In the silence that followed, with her children breathing softly around her and the wild mountain night held at bay by sturdy walls, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a tentative sense of security. It was a fragile feeling, one she knew better than to trust completely. But as sleep finally claimed her, Sarah Mitchell couldn't help but wonder if perhaps their dire predicament had led them not to disaster, but to an unexpected salvation in the form of a solitary scout, who moved through these mountains like a shadow. The storm had trapped them, yes, but it had also brought them Elijah Blackwood, and something told her that their journey together was only just beginning. Dawn broke clear and brilliant over the mountains, the freshly fallen snow transforming the rugged landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Sarah woke to the sound of the cabin door closing softly. Through the frost-edged window, she caught a glimpse of Elijah moving into the trees, rifle in hand, his figure soon swallowed by the dense forest. "Where did he go?" Thomas asked, already awake and stoking the fire. "Hunting, I imagine," Sarah replied, carefully extricating herself from Emma and James, both still sleeping soundly. The twins stirred in the upper bunk, Andrew's tousled head appearing over the edge. "Is it still snowing?" "No, it's stopped. The sky's clear." Sarah moved to the window, assessing the transformed landscape. The snow lay deep, at least 2 feet in open areas, with drifts piled higher against the cabin walls. "We won't be traveling today, that's certain." Abigail joined her at the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass. "Do you think he'll come back?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "Who, Mr. Blackwood? Of course he will. Uncle Jeremiah said people like him can't be trusted," Abigail said matter-of-factly. "He said they're treacherous by nature." Sarah stiffened, anger flaring at the casual prejudice her children had absorbed from her brother-in-law. "Your uncle, Jeremiah, is wrong about many things, Abigail. Mr. Blackwood saved our lives. Whatever else he may be, he deserves our respect and gratitude." Abigail seemed to consider this, her young face serious. "I like him," she finally decided. "He doesn't talk to us like we're stupid, the way Uncle Jeremiah did." Sarah smoothed her daughter's tangled hair, heart aching at the simple observation. "That's because Mr. Blackwood is a good man. Now let's see what we can do about breakfast." They assembled a modest meal from the cabin's stores, corn mush sweetened with the last of their sugar. Emma woke long enough to eat a few spoonfuls before drifting back to sleep, her recovery still tenuous but progressing. Mid-morning brought Elijah's return, announced by the crunch of boots on snow before the door swung open. He entered in a swirl of cold air, stamping snow from his boots. A brace of rabbits hung from his belt, and his pack bulged with what looked like pine boughs. "Rabbits!" James exclaimed, fully awake now and bouncing with excitement. "Can I see?" Elijah studied the boy for a moment, then nodded, crouching to James's level as he untied the rabbits from his belt. "Ever skinned one before?" James shook his head, eyes wide. "Want to learn?" Sarah opened her mouth to object. James was only 4, far too young for such tasks, but stopped herself. This wasn't Philadelphia, with its protected childhoods and gentle sensibilities. This was the frontier, where survival skills could mean the difference between life and death. Thomas stepped forward eagerly. "I can help too. Pa started teaching me, but—" He broke off, swallowing hard. Elijah's gaze shifted to the older boy, something like understanding passing across his features. "Good. More hands make lighter work." He glanced at Sarah, a silent question in his expression. She nodded her permission, though unease still prickled at the edges of her consciousness. There was something unsettling about watching her youngest child handle a hunting knife under the tutelage of a man who was still largely a stranger, no matter how much they owed him. While Thomas and James helped Elijah prepare the rabbits, Abigail and Andrew sorted through the pine boughs he'd collected, following his instructions to separate the needles from the branches. "Pine needle tea," he explained briefly when Sarah questioned the purpose. "Good for coughs, keeps away mountain sickness." Sarah watched him work, noting the patience with which he guided the children's hands, correcting gently when needed. His movements were precise, efficient, nothing wasted. When the rabbits were skinned and cleaned, he showed Thomas how to stretch the pelts for later use. "Small, but good for mittens," he explained, demonstrating the technique. "Waste nothing." The stew that eventually bubbled on the stove filled the cabin with savory aromas that made Sarah's mouth water. It had been days since any of them had eaten properly, and the simple meal felt like a feast. Emma managed to join them at the table, pale but determined, her eyes bright with interest, as Elijah answered the twins' endless questions about life. In the mountains, he spoke sparingly, choosing his words with care, but there was no coldness in his reserve, merely a natural economy of expression. "How long have you lived out here alone?" Andrew asked between spoonfuls of stew. "7 winters," Elijah replied. "Don't you get lonely?" Abigail pressed, her natural curiosity overcoming the wariness Sarah had observed earlier. A shadow passed over Elijah's face. Alone and lonely aren't the same thing. Sarah caught the subtle distinction in his words, a philosophy she'd never considered. Since Matthew's death, she'd felt the crushing weight of isolation even when surrounded by his family. Loneliness had been her constant companion, exacerbated rather than alleviated by the pitying glances and whispered comments of those who claimed to care. "Why do you help the army?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I heard soldiers killed your people." "Thomas!" Sarah exclaimed, mortified by her son's bluntness, but Elijah merely set down his spoon, meeting the boy's gaze directly. "Some did, some didn't. World's not that simple." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "I track the army because it keeps settlers and Cheyenne apart. Fewer misunderstandings, fewer deaths on both sides." Thomas absorbed this, his young face solemn. "That makes sense. Sometimes the best path lies between two worlds," Elijah added, his amber eyes flickering briefly to Sarah before returning to Thomas. "Understanding both, belonging fully to neither." There was something in those words, a melancholy wisdom that spoke of hard-won experience, that resonated with Sarah. As a widow, she too existed in a liminal space, no longer a wife, but forever shaped by that role, not quite fitting among the married women, nor among the unmarried. After the meal, while the children cleared away the dishes, Elijah beckoned Sarah to the door. "Need to talk," he said quietly. Outside, the cold air bit at her skin, but the brilliant sunshine offered some warmth. Elijah led her a short distance from the cabin, where a fallen log provided a makeshift bench brushed clear of snow. "What is it?" Sarah asked, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Elijah surveyed the glittering landscape, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Your girl's better, but not strong enough to travel far." "Not yet." Sarah nodded, having reached the same conclusion herself. "How long, do you think?" 3 days, maybe 4. His gaze remained fixed on the distant mountains. "There's another problem. Path to Carson Creek will be dangerous after the snow, avalanche country." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through Sarah. "What are you saying?" "Saying there's another route, longer but safer." Elijah finally turned to look at her, his expression grave. "Through Blackfoot Valley." Sarah frowned, the name unfamiliar. "Is that bad?" "It's complicated." He chose The word carefully. Valley belongs to the Jefferson Mining Company now. They don't welcome travelers without business. Then how would we pass through? I have history there. Worked as a guide when they first came to survey. His mouth tightened slightly. Owner's son owes me a favor. Sarah studied him, sensing there was more to this story than he was revealing. And the alternative? Wait 2 weeks for the passes to clear, or risk the avalanche route. Neither option seemed viable. 2 weeks would deplete what little resources they had left, and Sarah refused to risk her children's lives on a dangerous mountain path. Yet the mining company route raised other concerns. These mining people, she said slowly, can they be trusted? Something flickered in Elijah's eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. Some, not all. That's not very reassuring. Truth rarely is. He picked up a pine cone, turning it in his calloused hands. But I know the guards, the routines. We can pass through without much notice if we're careful. Sarah weighed her options, wishing not for the first time that Matthew were here to share this burden. But he wasn't, and the decision fell to her alone. You've done nothing but help us, she said finally. Yet I know almost nothing about you. Why should I trust you with my children's lives? Elijah was silent for a long moment, the pine cone rotating slowly between his fingers. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. My sister had a husband once. White man, worked for the railroad. When cholera took him, she was left with 3 children and no place to go. Railroad company evicted her from company housing. No one would rent to a half-breed widow. The bitterness in the last words was the first real emotion Sarah had heard. In his voice. She tried to reach our mother's people. Died on the trail with her youngest. Other 2 lasted another winter. The stark tragedy of his words hung in the cold air between them. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered, understanding now the shadows that haunted his eyes. Elijah shook his head slightly, as if dismissing her sympathy. Not telling you for pity, telling you so you understand. I know what happens to women alone, with children in this country. Won't let it happen again, if I can help it. The simplicity of his declaration, stripped of sentimentality, yet profound in its commitment, moved Sarah more than flowery promises could have. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. We'll take the valley route. Elijah nodded once. Decision made. We leave tomorrow if your girl's strong enough. Need to reach Walker's Ridge by nightfall. As they walked back to the cabin, Sarah found herself studying Elijah's profile, seeing him differently now. The reserve she'd initially interpreted as coldness revealed itself as something else, a careful guardedness born of loss, and perhaps of moving between worlds that viewed him with suspicion. Inside, they found Emma sitting up in bed, color returning to her cheeks as she listened to one of the twins' elaborate stories. Her recovery, while not complete, had progressed remarkably under Elijah's care. Feeling better? Sarah asked, touching her daughter's forehead. Emma nodded. Mr. Blackwood's tea tastes terrible, but it helped. Can I try walking a little? Tomorrow, Elijah said from the doorway. Rest today, strength for tomorrow. The remainder of the day passed in practical preparations for their journey. Elijah showed Thomas and the twins how to wrap strips of rabbit fur around their bootlaces for added warmth. Sarah inventoried their meager supplies, setting aside a small portion of cornmeal and dried beans as emergency rations. As evening approached, Emma convinced Elijah to teach her the dice game he'd shown the others the previous day. Sarah watched their interaction with interest, noting how the scout's taciturn manner softened almost imperceptibly with the children. There was a gentleness beneath his stern exterior, revealed in small gestures, the careful way he adjusted, the blanket around Emma's shoulders, the patience with which he explained the game's rules. You're good with them, Sarah observed later, as the children prepared for bed. Have you been around children much? Elijah's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes shifted. My sister's boys. Before. The simple statement carried the weight of personal history, loss, regret, perhaps guilt. Sarah wanted to ask more, but sensed his reluctance to elaborate. Children are resilient, she said instead, more than we sometimes give them credit for. Like their mother. The comment was unexpected, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to remark on the weather. Sarah felt a flush rise to her cheeks, unaccustomed to personal observations from this man who kept his own thoughts so carefully guarded. Necessity makes us stronger than we believe possible. Elijah nodded, his gaze thoughtful. First snow my sister and I spent alone after our father died. We thought we wouldn't survive till spring, but we did. Human spirit bends before it breaks. It was the most he'd said at one time since they'd met, and Sarah sensed that such revelations were rare. She felt oddly privileged to have been granted this glimpse beneath his carefully maintained reserve. What happened to her? Sarah asked softly. Your sister? Pain flickered across his features. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Pneumonia, winter of 73, after her boys. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sarah understood loss intimately, the way it hollowed you out, leaving spaces that could never quite be filled again. I'm sorry, she said simply. Elijah acknowledged her words with a slight inclination of his head. It was a long time ago, but time, Sarah knew, was no reliable healer of such wounds. They remained, changing perhaps in character, but never truly disappearing, like the scar that marked her palm, where she'd gripped the plough handle too tightly that first spring after Matthew's death, determined to work his fields herself rather than accept Jeremiah's insulting offers of assistance. The cabin grew quiet as the children settled into sleep, their breathing forming a gentle counterpoint to the occasional pop and hiss of the fire. Elijah checked the door latch one final time before taking his customary position against the wall, rifle within easy reach. You should sleep, Sarah told him. You've barely rested since finding us. I'm fine, Elijah. She used his name deliberately, noting how his eyes widened slightly at the direct address. You can't guide us safely if you're exhausted. We need you to be alert. He seemed to consider this, then nodded once. 4 hours, then I take watch it again. It was a compromise, but Sarah accepted it, recognizing the deep-rooted vigilance that likely kept him alive in this unforgiving wilderness. As she settled beside her sleeping children, she found herself wondering what trails of loss and survival had led Elijah Blackwood to this solitary existence in the mountains. Tomorrow they would begin their journey through a mining valley he approached with obvious caution. Whatever awaited them there, Sarah suspected it would reveal more about this enigmatic man who had appeared in their darkest hour like an answer to an unspoken prayer. With that thought lingering in her mind, Sarah Mitchell drifted into sleep. Her last conscious awareness, the reassuring presence of their unlikely guardian keeping watch in the shadows. They departed the line shack at first light, the eastern sky painted in strokes of rose and gold against the snow-capped peaks. Emma, though still weak, insisted on walking under her own power. Sarah watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, ready to intervene at the first sign of fatigue. Elijah led their procession, breaking trail through knee-deep snow. He moved with the fluid economy that Sarah had come to recognize as his natural state. No wasted motion, no unnecessary effort. Thomas followed closely behind, deliberately placing his boots in the footprints Elijah created. The twins came next, then Emma, with Sarah and James bringing up the rear. How far to this Walker's Ridge? Sarah asked during their first brief rest, adjusting the makeshift pack that contained their meager possessions. 8 miles, Elijah replied, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Rough country, but manageable if we pace ourselves. 8 miles through mountain terrain with 5 children, one still recovering from fever. Sarah swallowed her apprehension, focusing instead on the immediate task of securing James's scarf more tightly around his small face. "The mining company," she ventured, keeping her voice low enough that the children wouldn't hear. "You mentioned complications. Should I be concerned?" Something flickered across Elijah's face, a shadow of memory, perhaps. "Jefferson Mining operates like its own kingdom. Private guards, company rules." He adjusted the rifle slung across his back. "Owner's son, Richard, and I have history, but the debt he owes should get us passage." "What kind of debt?" Sarah pressed, needing more reassurance than his cryptic answers provided. Elijah met her gaze directly. "I pulled him from a mine collapse 3 years back, saved his life." He paused, then added with grim finality, "Whether he honors that debt remains to be seen." The journey resumed, their progress slower than Sarah had hoped, but steady. The landscape transformed around them as they descended from the high ridge where the line shack had stood. Dense pine forests gave way to more open terrain, the snow-covered ground rolling in gentle swells before plunging into steeper valleys. By mid-morning, Emma's strength began to flag. Sarah noticed her daughter's increasingly labored breathing, and the way she stumbled on even minor obstacles. Before she could intervene, Elijah dropped back from his lead position. "You're tired," he stated simply, addressing Emma directly rather than speaking through Sarah, as most men would have done. Emma straightened, pride warring with exhaustion on her small face. "I can keep going." Elijah nodded, respecting her determination without challenging it. "No doubt, but wisdom knows when to rest and when to push." He unslung a small pack from his shoulder. "Sit. 10 minutes. All of us." The children needed no further encouragement, dropping onto fallen logs or convenient rocks. Elijah produced strips of dried rabbit meat, distributing them along with a water skin that Sarah suspected contained more of his medicinal tea. "Drink," he instructed Emma quietly. "Restores strength." As the girl sipped the liquid, grimacing slightly at its bitter taste, Elijah moved to join Thomas, who had wandered a short distance away to examine tracks in the snow. "Elk," Sarah heard him explain, crouching beside her son. 5, maybe 6, passed through before dawn. Thomas studied the impressions with intense concentration. "How can you tell when they came through?" "Snow in the tracks. Fresh fall settles differently than older tracks." Elijah traced one impression with a gloved finger. "See the edges? Still sharp. Recent." Sarah watched their interaction with interest. Thomas had withdrawn into himself after his father's death, his natural curiosity dimmed by grief and responsibility. Yet with Elijah, some of that boyish wonder had returned. He asked questions, listened intently to the answers, his eyes bright with an engagement she hadn't seen in months. When they resumed their journey, Sarah found herself walking alongside Elijah, the children now arranged in a different formation, as Thomas took responsibility for helping Emma. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being patient with him, with all of them." Elijah glanced at her, a question in his amber eyes. "Thomas," Sarah clarified. "He was so close to his father. When Matthew died." She trailed off, throat tightening. A round word still painful to speak aloud. "Boy needs a purpose," Elijah said after a moment. "Something beyond survival." The simple observation struck Sarah with unexpected force. In the desperate months since Matthew's death, survival had indeed been their sole focus, finding food, shelter, maintaining the barest necessities, while Jeremiah systematically stripped away their security. She had given little thought to what her children might need beyond these basics: I've been so focused on keeping them alive that I've forgotten about helping them live, she admitted, the realization both humbling and painful. Elijah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You've done what was necessary. That's no small thing. The validation coming from this man of few words eased something in Sarah's chest, a knot of self-recrimination she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. By mid-afternoon, Walker's Ridge came into view, a dramatic outcropping of stone that loomed against the western sky. At its base lay a small clearing where several massive pines provided shelter from the wind. Elijah led them toward this natural haven, his pace quickening as the light began to fade. We'll camp here, he announced, surveying the area with practiced efficiency. Good sightlines, protected from wind, dry wood available. The children, exhausted from the day's journey, slumped onto fallen logs, while Elijah demonstrated how to clear snow to create a camping area. Soon, a small fire crackled at the center of their camp, its warmth a welcome relief after hours in the bitter cold. No cabin tonight? James asked, his small face pinched with disappointment. Stars instead, Elijah replied, pointing upward where the first evening stars were appearing in the deepening blue. Better view. He showed Thomas and Andrew how to construct a simple lean-to using pine boughs and the single tarp he carried, creating a sheltered space large enough for Sarah and the children to sleep protected from the elements. For himself, he claimed only a spot near the fire, declining Sarah's insistence that he share the shelter. As darkness settled over the mountains, they shared a modest meal of journey bread, a dense, nutritious mixture Elijah had prepared at the Line Shack, and more of the rabbit meat. Sarah noticed how carefully he rationed their supplies, setting aside specific portions for the following day. "Is that Blackfoot Valley?" Thomas asked, pointing toward a dark expanse visible in the distance. Elijah nodded. "Jefferson Mine controls the Northwest Passage. We'll reach it by mid-morning tomorrow." "And they might not let us through?" Abigail asked, her young face serious in the firelight. "They might not," Elijah admitted, his honesty unwavering even with the children. "But we have alternatives if needed." "What alternatives?" Sarah questioned, aware that he hadn't mentioned any backup plan previously. Elijah met her gaze across the fire. "Old Trapper's Path. Steeper, less traveled. Not my first choice with children." The implication was clear. The alternate route would be significantly more challenging, perhaps even dangerous. Sarah nodded her understanding, grateful that he'd considered contingencies while hoping they wouldn't be necessary. As the night deepened and the children settled into sleep, huddled together beneath blankets in the makeshift shelter, Sarah remained. By the fire, troubled thoughts keeping exhaustion at bay. Elijah sat opposite her, methodically cleaning his rifle with practiced movements. "Tell me about mine," she said finally, her voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping children. "What should I expect?" Elijah's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "Jefferson started as a silver mine 10 years back, struck a rich vein, expanded operations. Now they control the whole valley, company town, guards at all access points, and the owner's son, the one who owes you a debt, Richard Jefferson." Elijah's expression remained neutral, but something in his tone suggested complexity beyond his words. "Harvard-educated, runs operations while his father stays in Denver. Ambitious man." "Is he dangerous?" Elijah considered this. "Not in the way of bullets and knives, in the way of power and privilege." He reassembled the rifle with swift, sure movements. "He honors his debts, usually." "That's not entirely reassuring," Sarah observed dryly. A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. "Truth rarely is." It was the second time he'd used that phrase, Sarah noted. A personal philosophy, perhaps, born of a life where comfortable illusions had proven costly. "If he refuses us passage," she pressed, "what then?" "Then we take the Trapper's Path," Elijah stowed the rifle within easy reach. "It's harder but safer than challenging Jefferson's authority." Sarah nodded, trying to quiet the anxiety building in her chest. Every step of this journey seemed to present new obstacles, new dangers to navigate. Yet sitting here in the flickering firelight, with her children sleeping peacefully nearby and this solemn, capable man standing guard, she felt an unexpected sense of security. "How did you come to be a scout?" she asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Elijah's gaze shifted to the fire, watching the dancing flames. "My father was a trapper, taught me the mountains. After he died, my mother took us back to her people for a time. When tensions rose between settlers and tribes, I found myself useful to both sides, understanding each, belonging fully to neither." The echo of his earlier words struck Sarah. "That must be a lonely place to stand." He shrugged slightly. "There are worse fates. Such as watching what you love destroyed because you couldn't prevent it." The words held an undercurrent of old pain, quickly masked as he added, "Sleep. Tomorrow will be challenging." Sarah recognized the deflection but didn't press further. Instead, she rose and moved toward the shelter, pausing beside him. "Wake me for the second watch. You need rest too." Elijah looked up at her, surprise briefly visible in his amber eyes before he nodded once in agreement. It was a small victory, this acceptance of shared responsibility, but it felt significant nonetheless. Morning arrived with a sky of flawless blue, the sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling panorama that momentarily took Sarah's breath away. She found Elijah already awake, though she suspected he'd ignored their agreement about sharing the watch, preparing a small breakfast from their dwindling supplies. Emma appeared stronger today, her cheeks showing more color and her movements more assured. The twins bickered good-naturedly as they packed up the makeshift camp, while James trailed after Elijah, peppering him with questions that the scout answered with surprising patience. They departed as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, making their way down from Walker's Ridge toward the valley below. The descent proved treacherous in places, the snow concealing icy patches and unstable ground. Twice Sarah nearly fell, saved only by Elijah's quick reflexes as he steadied her with a strong hand. "Thank you," she murmured after the second incident, embarrassed by her clumsiness. "Snow hides dangers," he replied simply, "no shame in needing support." By mid-morning, as Elijah had predicted, they reached the outer boundary of Jefferson Mining Company's territory. The transition was marked by a crude but unmistakable sign, nailed to a towering pine. "Jefferson Mining Company property trespassers will be prosecuted. All travelers must report to checkpoint." "Charming welcome," Sarah remarked, reading the stark warning. Elijah's expression darkened. Their hospitality doesn't improve inside. The checkpoint appeared a quarter-mile further along the trail, a sturdy log structure flanked by two armed guards. As their party approached, the guards straightened, rifles held ready but not quite aimed. "That's far enough," one called, a burly man with a beard streaked with gray. "State your business." Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of Sarah and the children. "Passage to Carson Creek. We need to cross the valley." The guard's eyes narrowed as he took in Elijah's appearance, lingering on the distinctive features that marked his native heritage. "No passage for your kind, half-breed. Company policy." Sarah felt a surge of indignation at the casual slur, but Elijah remained composed, his voice level. "Tell Richard Jefferson that Elijah Blackwood seeks passage. Remind him of the Silver Creek collapse." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the guard's face. He exchanged glances with his companion before nodding curtly. "Wait here." As the guard disappeared into the checkpoint building, Sarah moved to stand beside Elijah. "Will it work?" she asked quietly. "We'll see." His expression revealed nothing, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the knife at his belt. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as they waited. The remaining guard watched them with undisguised suspicion, his rifle never quite lowering. The children huddled closer to Sarah, sensing the hostile atmosphere. Finally, the first guard emerged from the building. "You and the woman can speak with Mr. Jefferson," he announced grudgingly. "Children stay here under guard." "Unacceptable," Sarah began, but Elijah silenced her with a subtle gesture. "The children come with us," he stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Or we find another route." The guard's face darkened with anger. "You don't make demands here, half-breed. This is Jefferson land. And these are Jefferson Mountains." Elijah replied evenly, "I know paths your guards have never found. Either we all speak with Richard, or none of us do." He turned as if to leave, gesturing for Sarah and the children to follow. "Wait." The guard's voice held less certainty now. "I'll check with Mr. Jefferson." When he returned several minutes later, his demeanor had shifted subtly. "Follow me, all of you." The grudging addition came with a scowl. They were led through the checkpoint and along a well-maintained road that wound deeper into the valley. As they walked, the scale of Jefferson Mining's operation became apparent. The forest had been cleared for hundreds of yards on either side of the road, the stripped land scarred by mining operations. In the distance, plumes of smoke rose from what appeared to be a substantial settlement. "Jefferson Town," Elijah explained quietly, noticing Sarah's questioning glance. "Company housing, stores, saloon, everything owned by Jefferson, including most of the people." The town itself proved to be a strange hybrid of frontier settlement and industrial operation. Neat rows of identical cabins housed the miners and their families, while larger structures, a company store, offices, and what appeared to be a meeting hall, formed the center of the community. Everything bore the Jefferson Mining Company emblem, a stylized J with a pickaxe through its center. They were escorted to the largest building, a two-story structure with actual glass windows, a luxury that spoke volumes about the wealth concentrated here. Inside, they were led to a spacious office where a man stood with his back to them, gazing out a window that overlooked the mining operations. "Elijah Blackwood," the man said without turning. "It's been, what? 2 years?" "3, Elijah corrected, his voice neutral. "Richard." Richard Jefferson turned then, revealing a handsome face marked by a thin scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw. A permanent reminder, Sarah guessed, of the mine collapse Elijah had mentioned. He was perhaps 35, expensively, dressed in a manner more suited to Denver's business district than a remote mining town. "I see you've brought company." Jefferson's gaze traveled over Sarah and the children with calculating assessment. "Quite a change from your usual solitary wanderings. They need passage to Carson Creek," Elijah stated simply. "I'm guiding them." Jefferson raised an eyebrow. "And you thought I'd simply allow this procession through my territory? Out of the goodness of my heart, perhaps?" "Out of respect for debts owed," Elijah replied evenly. A tense silence followed as the two men regarded each other, years of complex history evident in their locked gazes. Sarah stood straighter, acutely aware of her worn dress and the children's threadbare clothing against Jefferson's polished appearance. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said finally, extending her hand with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "These are my children. We're relocating to Carson Creek, where I've accepted a teaching position." Jefferson turned his attention to her, something like amusement flickering in his eyes as he took her offered hand. "A school teacher? How civilizing." He glanced back at Elijah. "I wouldn't have pictured you as an escort for respectable widows." "Blackwood, circumstances change," Elijah replied, his expression unreadable. Jefferson studied them both for another moment before moving to sit behind his imposing desk. "Well, this is an interesting dilemma. Company policy explicitly forbids passage to unaffiliated persons. a policy established after several unfortunate incidents with claim jumpers and labor agitators. His fingers drummed against the polished wood. On the other hand, I do indeed owe Mr. Blackwood a certain consideration. We'll be through your territory in a day, Sarah said, sensing an opening for negotiation. We seek nothing from your company except safe passage. Jefferson smiled, though the expression didn't reach. His eyes. Mrs. Mitchell, surely you understand that exceptions create dangerous precedents. If I allow you through today, tomorrow I'll have a dozen travelers claiming similar privileges. Then don't make it free, Elijah interjected. Charge a toll. Create a record. Maintain your control while allowing legitimate travelers passage. The suggestion appeared to interest Jefferson. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. A toll road through Jefferson territory, with appropriate security measures, of course. He nodded slowly. That has potential beyond your specific situation. Sarah glanced at Elijah, surprised by his strategic approach. He'd offered Jefferson not just a solution to their immediate problem, but a business opportunity, one that appealed to the man's evident pride in his commercial empire. I'll consider it, Jefferson decided finally. In the meantime, you may stay in town tonight as my guests. Tomorrow we'll discuss terms for your passage. He rang a small bell on his desk, summoning an assistant. Show Mrs. Mitchell and her children to the company guest house. Mr. Blackwood can bunk with the guards. We stay together, Elijah stated, his tone brooking no argument. Jefferson's eyes narrowed slightly. My hospitality has limits, Blackwood. Then we'll camp outside town, Elijah replied evenly. All of us. For a tense moment, Sarah thought Jefferson might refuse. Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound. Still as stubborn as ever, I see. Very well. The guest house has 2 rooms. I assume that arrangement will satisfy your protective instincts. As they were escorted from the office, Sarah caught a final exchange between the 2 men. This doesn't discharge my debt, Jefferson said quietly. I know, Elijah responded, his voice equally low. Outside, as they followed their guide through the ordered streets of Jefferson Town, Sarah moved closer to Elijah. What was that about? The debt? Elijah's expression remained inscrutable. Insurance, he replied cryptically, for whatever lies ahead. The Jefferson Mining Company guest house stood apart from the identical cabins that housed the miners, its exterior freshly painted and its porch swept clean of snow. Inside, a fire already burned in the hearth, and simple but adequate furnishings filled the 2 adjoining rooms. Sarah noted the contrast between this polished facade and the grim faces of the workers they'd passed on their way through town. Company uses this place for potential investors, Elijah explained quietly as they settled in. Keeps it nicer than the rest. Emma sank gratefully onto one of the beds, her face pale from the day's exertions. The twins immediately began exploring the space, while James climbed onto a chair by the window, pressing his nose against the glass to watch the activity in the street below. Look, Mama, real glass windows, he exclaimed, his breath fogging the pain. Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm, though her mind remained preoccupied with their precarious situation. Yes, it's very nice. But remember, we're just passing through. Thomas had remained unusually quiet since their meeting with Richard Jefferson. Now he approached Elijah, who stood by the door with the watchful attention that seemed his natural state. Why does he hate you? The boy asked bluntly. Elijah's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed the slight tensing of his shoulders. Hate's too simple a word for it, he replied after a moment. Jefferson owes me his life. That creates a different kind of feeling. But, Thomas, Sarah interrupted gently, perhaps Mr. Blackwood would prefer not to discuss this now. Elijah's amber eyes met hers, something like appreciation flickering in their depths. It's all right. Boys old enough to understand how the world works. He turned back to Thomas. Men like Jefferson don't like owing debts, especially to men. Like me. Because you're half Cheyenne, Thomas asked, his young face serious. That's part of it, Elijah acknowledged. But it's more than that. Jefferson builds his life on power, having it, showing it, using it. When I pulled him from that mine collapse, he was helpless, couldn't save himself. He glanced out the window, at the carefully ordered streets of the company town. Some men never forget being powerless, even for a moment. So he'll help us because he has to, not because he wants to, Thomas concluded, demonstrating an insight beyond his years. Elijah nodded. That's the way of it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah tensed, but Elijah seemed unsurprised as he opened it to reveal a young woman in a simple dress carrying a covered tray. Mr. Jefferson sends his compliments, she murmured, her eyes downcast. Supper for you and the children. Her gaze flickered briefly to Elijah before returning to the floor. There's nothing for you, sir. Mr. Jefferson says you can eat at the guard's mess if you're hungry. Sarah felt indignation rise in her chest at the deliberate slight, but Elijah merely nodded, stepping aside to allow the young woman entry. It's fine, he said quietly to Sarah as the woman set the tray on the small table. I have my own provisions. When the woman had gone, Sarah lifted the cloth covering the tray to reveal a simple but abundant meal, stew, bread, and even a small pot of preserves. The children gathered around eagerly, their earlier wariness forgotten in the face of fresh food after days of travel rations. This is a peace offering, Sarah observed, lowering her voice so the children wouldn't hear. Or a bribe? Both, Elijah replied. Jefferson negotiates through gestures as much as words. Sarah served the children first, then prepared a plate for herself, deliberately setting aside portions of everything. I'm not very hungry, she explained, when Elijah raised an eyebrow at her barely touched plate. Perhaps you could help finish. This later, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Perhaps. After the meal, with the children settled for the night in one room, Sarah and Elijah sat at the small table in the adjoining space. The plate she'd set aside remained between them, though Elijah had yet to touch it. You should eat, she urged. Tomorrow may be difficult. He studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting the bread she offered. Jefferson won't make things easy, he warned between bites, even with the debt. I gathered that. Sarah poured water from a pitcher into 2 tin cups. This place, it feels wrong somehow. The neatness of it against the hardness underneath. Elijah's gaze sharpened with interest. Most people only see the polish. I've lived with false appearances before, Sarah replied, thinking of Jeremiah's carefully maintained reputation as a pillar of the community, contrasted with his cold cruelty behind closed doors. You learn to recognize them. Your brother-in-law, Elijah guessed, demonstrating once again his uncanny ability to read between her words. Sarah nodded, her hands tightening around her cup. After Matthew died, he was all solicitude and Christian charity, in public. In private, he made it clear that I was a burden, that my children had no true claim to Mitchell land or property. The bitterness she'd suppressed for months surfaced, unexpectedly, sharpening her voice. He used Matthew's death to take everything, the farm, the livestock, even family heirlooms that should have passed to Thomas. Elijah listened without interruption, his steady gaze encouraging her to continue. When the teaching position in Carson Creek became available, he was the first to suggest I take it, even provided money for the journey. She laughed softly, the sound devoid of humor. His final act of generosity was to ensure we'd be gone before spring planting, with no claim to the harvest. Some men build their fortune on others' misfortune, Elijah observed quietly. Your brother-in-law and Jefferson would understand each other well. The parallel was apt, Sarah realized. Both men cloaked self-interest in the language of propriety and progress, using rules and traditions when they served their purposes, discarding them when they didn't. "Do you think Jefferson will allow us passage tomorrow?" she asked, redirecting the conversation from painful memories. Yes. Elijah's certainty surprised her, but not without extracting something in return. "We have nothing to give," Sarah pointed out, "barely enough money to establish ourselves in Carson Creek." "He won't want your money," Elijah replied, his expression darkening. "More likely information or a service." "What kind of service?" Elijah shook his head slightly. "Hard to predict. Jefferson's clever. He'll find something that costs us little, but benefits him greatly." He finished the last of the bread, his movements deliberate as he brushed crumbs from his hands. "Whatever he asks, let me handle the negotiation. Jefferson respects strength, nothing else." Sarah nodded, though part of her bristled at being sidelined. Since Matthew's death, she'd fought her own battles, made her own decisions, however difficult. Relying on another man's judgment, even one as capable as Elijah, felt like a step backward. "I understand your caution," she said carefully, "but I'm not without resources of my own. I negotiated the teaching position in Carson Creek through correspondence, secured housing for my children, and managed our journey this far before we met." Elijah studied her, something like respect kindling in his amber eyes. "Never doubted your capability," he said simply. "It's Jefferson's nature. I'm concerned with, not yours. He sees women as commodities." The implication sent a chill through Sarah. "You think he might—" "Not directly," Elijah assured her quickly. "He maintains appearances too carefully for that, but he'll test boundaries, look for weakness." His gaze held hers steadily. "Together, we present a stronger front." The word "together" lingered between them, carrying unexpected weight. In the flickering lamplight, Sarah studied the man across from her, this enigmatic scout who had appeared in their darkest hour. In the few days since they'd met, she'd witnessed his quiet competence, his unexpected gentleness with her children, his unwavering honesty even when truth was uncomfortable. "Together, then," she agreed softly. Morning arrived with a soft knock at their door. A different young woman stood outside, her manner as deferential as the previous evening's messenger. "Mr. Jefferson requests your presence at breakfast," she announced, not quite meeting their eyes. "At your convenience." Elijah's expression remained neutral, but Sarah detected tension in his posture. "Tell Mr. Jefferson we'll join him shortly," she replied, assuming the role of spokesperson. Once the messenger had departed, Elijah turned to Sarah. "Interesting. He's playing the gracious host now." "Is that good or bad?" she asked, already helping the children prepare for the day. "Neither. It's calculated." Elijah checked his knife before sliding it into his belt sheath. "Remember, every gesture is negotiation with Jefferson." They were escorted to Jefferson's private quarters, a surprisingly modestly house attached to the company offices. Inside, a dining room had been prepared for their arrival, the table set with china and silver that seemed incongruously formal in this frontier setting. Richard Jefferson rose as they entered, the perfect image of a cultured gentleman host. "Mrs. Mitchell, children, welcome." His gaze slid past Elijah as if he weren't present. "Please be seated. I hope you found your accommodations comfortable." "Very, thank you," Sarah replied, guiding her children to their places while keeping a carefully neutral expression. Jefferson himself assisted her with her chair, a courtesy that felt performative rather than genuine. Only when everyone was seated did he acknowledge Elijah with a curt nod. "Blackwood, I trust you managed to find sustenance last evening?" "I managed," Elijah replied evenly, his posture relaxed but alert. Breakfast proceeded with strained pleasantries. Jefferson directed most of his conversation to Sarah and the children, asking about their journey and their plans in Carson Creek with what appeared to be genuine interest. Only occasionally did his gaze drift to Elijah, each time with a calculating assessment that belied his affable manner. "I understand you're to be the new school teacher," Jefferson remarked to Sarah as servants cleared away the main course. "Carson Creek is fortunate. Education is the cornerstone of civilization after all." "That's my belief as well," Sarah replied, watching as he poured coffee from a silver pot. "We maintain a school here in Jefferson Town," he continued. "Nothing elaborate, but the basics. Reading, figures, enough writing to sign a contract." He smiled thinly. "Essential skills for future miners." "And their sisters?" Sarah inquired, noting that he'd mentioned only male students. "Do they receive education as well?" Something flashed in Jefferson's eyes. Irritation, perhaps, at being challenged even obliquely. "Of course, though their curriculum naturally differs. More emphasis on domestic arts, less on mathematics, practical preparation for their futures." Sarah bit back a sharper response, aware of Elijah's cautioning presence beside her. "I find all children benefit from a complete education," she said instead. "One never knows what path life may require them to walk." Jefferson regarded her with renewed interest. A progressive viewpoint. How refreshing. His tone suggested the opposite. "Speaking of paths, I've considered your request for passage through Jefferson territory." The abrupt transition signaled the beginning of the real conversation. Sarah straightened in her chair, while Elijah remained perfectly still, watching. "I'm inclined to grant it," Jefferson continued, "with certain conditions." "What conditions?" Elijah asked, speaking for the first time since the meal began. Jefferson turned to him, their gazes locking in silent challenge. "Nothing onerous. First payment of a toll, a nominal amount to establish the principle. $5 should suffice." The sum represented a significant portion of their meager funds, but Sarah nodded her acceptance. The price of passage was worth it. "Second," Jefferson continued, "you'll be escorted by my men along the approved route. No deviations, no exploration." Again, reasonable enough. Sarah glanced at Elijah, who nodded slightly. "And third," Jefferson's smile took on a predatory edge, "Mr. Blackwood will provide certain information regarding the northern trails, specifically those used by independent trappers and miners to circumvent company territory." And there it was, the true price. Elijah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're asking him to betray people who trust those routes for their livelihoods," Sarah observed, unable to remain silent. Jefferson turned to her, eyebrows raised. In mock surprise, "Betray. Such a harsh characterization, Mrs. Mitchell. I merely seek information about trails through territory that legally belongs to Jefferson Mining. Surely you can't object to a property owner knowing who crosses his land." Before Sarah could respond, Elijah spoke, his voice deceptively casual. "Those trails have been used by trappers since before your father claimed the valley. They harm. Nothing. Take nothing from your operation." "Nevertheless, they cross Jefferson land," Richard insisted, his pleasant facade hardening. "The information, Blackwood, or find another route to Carson Creek." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the naked extortion. "Mr. Jefferson, surely. I'll provide locations of the main northern trail," Elijah interrupted, his gaze never leaving Jefferson's face. "One trail, not all, and only if you guarantee safe passage for any travelers you encounter there." Jefferson considered this counteroffer, drumming his fingers against the tablecloth. "The 3 primary trails," he countered, "and I'll instruct my men to treat legitimate travelers with courtesy." Elijah shook his head once. 2 trails. Your men allow all non-mining traffic to pass unhindered, and they don't confiscate equipment or supplies. The negotiation continued in this vein for several minutes, each man giving ground incrementally until they reached a compromise. 2 major trails identified, guaranteed safe passage for non-mining travelers with payment of a reduced toll, no seizure of personal equipment. Agreed, Jefferson said finally, extending his hand across the table. Elijah hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake, his expression unreadable. Excellent. Jefferson's affable manner returned instantly, as if the tense negotiation had never occurred. Now, Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps the children might enjoy seeing our company school while I finalize arrangements for your escort. Miss Wilson, our teacher, would be delighted to show them around. Sarah glanced at Elijah, who gave a subtle nod. That sounds lovely, she replied, though the prospect of separating from her children, even briefly, made her uneasy. As a young woman led the children away, with Thomas throwing a worried glance back at his mother. Jefferson leaned forward, his mask of geniality slipping. Now, Blackwood, those trail details, and don't try to mislead me, my men will verify your information. Sarah watched as Elijah provided exactly what he'd agreed to. Locations of 2 major trails with specific landmarks and directional information. He delivered the details with calm precision, neither rushing nor withholding, his face betraying no emotion, even as he compromised trails that likely represented safety to people. He knew. When the transaction was complete, Jefferson leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his expression. Our business is concluded, then. Your escort will be ready within the hour. He rose, signaling the end of their meeting. A pleasure doing business with you both. As they left Jefferson's quarters to collect the children, Sarah moved closer. To Elijah. Are you all right? She asked quietly. What you had to do? What's done is done, he replied, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of tension she hadn't heard before. The trails I gave him were already known to some of his men. I've warned most who use them to find alternatives. Even so, Sarah touched his arm briefly, the gesture instinctive. It couldn't have been easy. Elijah glanced down at her hand, then met her gaze directly. Few important choices are. A moment passed between them, heavy with unspoken understanding, before he added, We should find your children. They located the children at the company school, a utilitarian building near the center of town. Inside, rows of rough-hewn desks faced a small blackboard, the space neater than Sarah had expected, but devoid of the books and educational materials she considered essential. Thomas looked bored, the twins uncomfortable, and Emma openly dismayed by what they'd seen. "Mama," Emma whispered as Sarah gathered them to leave. "The teacher here only lets girls learn letters, not real arithmetic, and they don't have any proper books, just readers with stories about obeying parents and employers." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly. "Things will be different in Carson Creek, I promise. You'll all have a proper education." Their escort, 4 mounted company guards, and a wagon for Sarah and the children awaited them at the town's edge. Elijah reviewed the arrangements with a critical eye, checking the wagon's construction and speaking briefly with the lead guard. Sarah noticed how the guards treated him with wary respect, maintaining their distance even while following their orders to provide escort. As they prepared to depart, Richard Jefferson appeared for a final farewell, riding a sleek bay horse that probably cost more than a miner's yearly wage. "Safe travels, Mrs. Mitchell," he called, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Carson Creek is fortunate to gain such an independent-minded schoolteacher." His gaze shifted to Elijah, the false warmth vanishing. "Blackwood, remember our arrangement regarding those trails?" Elijah nodded once, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. As their party moved away from Jefferson Town, following the road that would lead them through the valley and eventually to Carson Creek, Sarah found herself studying Elijah's profile. The morning's events had revealed new dimensions to the quiet scout, his strategic approach to negotiation, his unwillingness to completely capitulate even when at a disadvantage, his ability to protect what mattered most while compromising. On the peripheral, "You handled him well," she observed as they rode side by side, her driving the wagon while he rode a horse borrowed from the company stable. "Better than I would have alone." Elijah glanced at her, something like surprise flickering in his amber eyes. "You underestimate yourself. You're stronger than you know." The simple statement, delivered without flattery or condescension, warmed something in Sarah's chest. Unlike Jeremiah, who had constantly reminded her of her supposed weaknesses, or even Matthew, who had loved her dearly but sometimes protected her from harsh realities, Elijah spoke to her as an equal, capable of understanding difficult truths and making hard choices. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done for us." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than usual. "You've done as much for your children on your own. I just happened along at the right moment." "I think it was more than happenstance," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the admission. "Call it providence or fate or simple good fortune, but I believe there was purpose in our meeting." Elijah didn't respond immediately, his attention seemingly focused on the trail ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Perhaps I've learned not to question the few good things life offers." The stark simplicity of his philosophy touched Sarah deeply. How many good things had been stripped from this man's life to leave him with such modest expectations? Yet despite everything, he had extended himself for strangers, risked his standing with the independent trappers whose trails he'd revealed, all to help a widow and children who had no claim on his assistance. As they continued their journey through Jefferson's domain, under the watchful eyes of company guards, Sarah Mitchell realized that somewhere between the canyon ledge and this moment, her feelings toward Elijah Blackwood had undergone a profound transformation. What had begun as desperate gratitude had evolved into something more complex: respect, trust, and an emotional connection she hadn't anticipated. Whether this connection would survive beyond their journey to Carson Creek remained to be seen. But for now, riding beside him with her children safe in the wagon behind her, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. Elijah Blackwood had become more than their rescuer. He had become essential. Their journey through Jefferson mining territory lasted 2 days, the company guards maintaining a watchful presence that never quite crossed into hostility but never relaxed into friendliness either. Elijah rode ahead most of the time, scouting the path with the vigilance that seemed as natural to him as breathing. On the evening of the second day, they reached the eastern boundary of Jefferson's domain, marked by another wooden sign nearly identical to the one they'd encountered at the entrance. Beyond it, the mountains rose majestic against the darkening sky, their snow-capped peaks burnished gold by the setting sun. "This is where we leave you," the lead guard announced, his tone suggesting relief rather than regret. "Carson Creek's 3 days northeast, following the river valley." Sarah thanked the men with polite formality, while Elijah said nothing, merely watching as they turned their horses and departed, their figures growing smaller against the stark white landscape until they disappeared around a bend. "They're gone," Thomas observed, climbing down from the wagon to stand beside Elijah. "Really? Gone?" "They won't follow," Elijah confirmed, his posture relaxing subtly for the first time in 2 days. "We're beyond Jefferson's reach now." They made camp beneath towering pines that sheltered them from the wind, the wagon providing additional protection for the children as they slept. Sarah sat beside the small fire Elijah had built, watching the flames dance, while her mind turned over the events of the past week. From the terror of the canyon ledge to the tense negotiations at Jefferson Town, Each step had brought them closer to safety and had revealed more about the quiet scout who had become their protector. "What are you thinking?" Elijah asked, his voice low as he joined her by the fire. Sarah glanced at him, noting how the firelight cast his features in warm relief against the gathering darkness. "That a week ago I didn't know you existed. Now I can't imagine how we would have survived. Without you." Something flickered in his amber eyes, perhaps discomfort with her gratitude, or perhaps something deeper. "You're stronger than you know. You would have found a way." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but I'm glad we didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind since they'd left Jefferson Town. "What will you do after we reach Carson Creek?" Elijah's gaze shifted to the fire, his expression unreadable. "Continue as before, scouting, trapping, tracking when needed." "Alone?" The word escaped before Sarah could consider its implications. His eyes returned to hers, searching. "It's what I know." The simple statement carried layers of meaning, a life shaped by solitude, by moving between worlds, by learning to expect and need nothing beyond his own capability. And yet, watching him with her children over the past days, Sarah had glimpsed another possibility beneath that solitary exterior. "It doesn't have to be," she said quietly. "What you know, I mean." Elijah went very still, the only movement the slight rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. "Carson Creek might not welcome someone like me living too close," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Then they'll have to reconsider their welcome," Sarah replied with unexpected firmness. "The town that hired a widow with 5 children, who can learn to accept a man who saved those children's lives." A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You speak as if it were simple." "Not simple," Sarah amended, "but possible, if you wanted it to be." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. Then Elijah reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing hers, with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I haven't wanted much in a long time," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Safer that way." Sarah turned her hand beneath his, their palms meeting in a touch that said more than words could convey. "Safety isn't everything," she murmured. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks spiraling upward into the star-filled sky as an understanding took shape, fragile but real, uncertain but hopeful. Morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose as they prepared for the final leg of their journey. The children moved with a lighter energy, aware that their ordeal was nearing its end. Even Emma, still recovering her full strength, joined her siblings in their excited chatter about what Carson Creek might hold. Thomas, however, seemed preoccupied as he helped Elijah load their few possessions into the wagon. When the other children were occupied with gathering their bedrolls, he approached the scout with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Are you coming with us to Carson Creek?" he asked, his young voice striving for casualness but betraying his concern. Elijah paused in his work, giving the boy his full attention. "Yes." "But after that," Thomas pressed, a furrow appearing between his brows, "will you just leave once we're settled?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Elijah off guard. He glanced toward Sarah, who stood by the wagon, close enough to hear but pretending to be occupied with checking the harness. "I haven't decided yet," Elijah answered honestly, showing Thomas the respect of an unvarnished truth. "What do you think I should do?" The question surprised Thomas, his eyes widening, slightly before his expression settled into serious consideration. "I think you should stay," he said finally. "Ma smiles more when you're around, and I still have a lot to learn about tracking and hunting." Elijah's expression softened, the usual guardedness giving way to something warmer. "Those are good reasons to consider," he acknowledged. "Thank you for telling me." The journey to Carson Creek took them through increasingly gentle terrain as they descended from the high mountain passes into the broader valley that cradled the small but growing settlement. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a ridge to find the town spread before them, a collection of wooden buildings nestled along a creek that glittered like silver in the winter sunlight. "There it is," Sarah breathed, relief and apprehension mingling in her chest. "Our new home." Elijah studied the settlement with a scout's eye. Good location, defensible, water source, timber nearby. "It looks so small," Emma observed from the wagon seat beside her mother. "Bigger than it appears," Elijah replied. "Probably 300 people, growing." They approached along the main road, their arrival drawing curious glances from townsfolk going about their afternoon business. Sarah felt the weight of their scrutiny, aware of their bedraggled appearance after days of travel. Beside her, Elijah sat straight in his saddle, his expression composed but alert, sensing the subtle shift in atmosphere as people noticed his presence. The schoolhouse was easy to identify, a whitewashed building near the center of town with a small bell tower. Beside it stood a modest house that Sarah guessed would be her assigned residence as the town's teacher. Her heart quickened at the sight, hope and anxiety tangling together as the wagon rolled to a stop before the building. A middle-aged man, with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, emerged from the schoolhouse, regarding their party with evident surprise. "Mrs. Mitchell?" he inquired, approaching the wagon. "Yes," Sarah confirmed, gathering her composure, "and these are my children. You must be Mr. Williams, the school board representative." "Jackson Williams, yes." His gaze traveled over the children before settling on Elijah with undisguised curiosity. "We weren't expecting you for another week, given the storm reports. And your letter mentioned nothing about a companion. Mr. Blackwood saved our lives when we became trapped in Aspen Canyon," Sarah explained, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street where several townspeople had paused to observe the exchange. "Without his intervention, we would not have survived." Williams studied Elijah with greater interest. "Is that so? Well then, Carson Creek owes you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Blackwood." Elijah nodded once in acknowledgement, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. The next hours passed in a blur of introductions and settling in. The teacher's house, though small, was clean and solidly built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a modest sitting area. The school board had provided basic furnishings and a small stockpile of provisions as part of Sarah's contract, a generosity that brought tears to her eyes after months of precarity. Elijah remained a quiet presence throughout, helping to unload the wagon and establish their basic comforts, but saying little. As evening approached, Sarah found him outside, securing the horses in the small stable behind the house. "Mr. Williams offered you the spare room above the livery stable," she said, joining him in the gathering dusk. "He says the owner could use help with the horses when you're not otherwise occupied." Elijah nodded, his hands continuing their methodical work with the horses. "Decent offer." "It is," Sarah agreed, watching his profile in the fading light. "But I have another suggestion." He turned to face her fully, his expression questioning. "The teacher's house has a small room off the kitchen," she explained. "Meant for a housekeeper, I believe, though the board couldn't afford to provide one. It would be cramped, but—" "People would talk," Elijah interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "People always talk," Sarah countered. "They talked when Matthew had died. They talked when Jeremiah forced us out. They'll talk regardless of what we do or don't do." "It's different for a school teacher," Elijah persisted. "Your position depends on reputation." Sarah stepped closer, her resolve strengthening rather than diminishing in the face of his concern. "My position depends on competence and dedication, which I have in abundance. And the board needs me more than I need them. The last 3 candidates declined once they learned how remote Carson Creek is. A faint smile touched Elijah's lips. You've thought this through. I've had practice making difficult decisions, she replied, returning his smile with one of her own. The question isn't what others will think. It's what you want. Elijah was silent for a long moment, his amber eyes studying her with an intensity that might have been unsettling if she hadn't come to understand the way he evaluated situations, thoroughly, carefully, leaving nothing to chance. What I want, he repeated finally, as if testing the concept. It's been a long time since that mattered. It matters now, Sarah said simply. To me, to my children. In the deepening twilight, with the sounds of the small town settling around them, Elijah Blackwood made his choice. He reached out, taking Sarah's hand in his own calloused one, the gesture speaking more eloquently than words. Then I'll stay, he said quietly. Not in the livery. Here. Sarah's heart swelled with an emotion, too complex to name. Relief, joy, hope, all tangled together in a warmth that spread through her chest. Here, she agreed. Inside the house, the children's voices rose in a comfortable cacophony as they explored their new home. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression brightening when he saw Elijah still present. Mr. Blackwood, come see the bookshelves in the main room. They're nearly empty now, but Ma says we'll fill them soon enough. Elijah glanced at Sarah, a question in his eyes that had nothing to do with bookshelves and everything to do with the future they were tentatively building. Go on, she encouraged, her smile reaching her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. We have time now. As they walked together toward the house that was becoming a home, Sarah Mitchell reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate terror of the canyon ledge to the promise of a new beginning, their path had been transformed by the Half-Cheyenne scout who had found them in their darkest hour. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she harbored no illusions that their life would be without difficulties, they would face them together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as partners in a shared future neither had expected, but both now embraced. In the warm light spilling from the doorway, with her children's laughter as a backdrop and Elijah's steady presence beside her, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe in more than mere survival. This was the beginning of something new, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by the unexpected bonds that can form even in the harshest wilderness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.